The wind screamed across the barren plain, carrying dust and shards of stone like knives. The shelter shook under the weight of the storm. Commander Rourke lay inside, curled in his patched survival blanket, listening to the endless howl. He had built this place from the wreckage of his escape pod, hammering panels into the rock until he could seal the cracks with resin and desperation. It was not much, but it had kept him alive for 22 days. Outside, the planet wanted him, dead. Inside, every moment was borrowed time. The small heater hummed weakly, flickering every so often as if it too was thinking of giving up. Rourke lay on the narrow strip of ground where the metal floor had been leveled out. He tried to let his body rest, though sleep never came easy. Every time he closed his eyes, he half expected the shelter walls to rip away and the storm to swallow him whole. When exhaustion finally won, it was deep and dreamless. He did not know how long he slept, but when he woke, it was not the storm that drew his eyes open. It was the presence of someone else. At first, he thought it was a trick of his tired mind. His pulse raced, and he forced himself not to move too quickly. A shape lay beside him, curled in silence, breathing slow and steady. The light of the heater flickered across skin that was not human. Silver blue, faintly glowing under the shifting shadows. Long fingers folded against the chest. Hair, or something like it, dark and braided with thin metal wires. An alien. His first thought was that he was already dead and dreaming in some strange afterlife. His second thought, sharper and colder, was that he was not alone anymore. He was lying next to one of them. The war had shown humanity what these beings could do. They were faster, stronger, older. Their empire spanned systems while Earth was still crawling toward the stars with half-built colonies. They had crushed entire fleets. He had seen their weapons cut through steel like fire through paper. And now one of them was here, so close. He could feel the warmth of her body. His hand twitched toward the knife at his belt, the last real weapon he had. The instinct to defend himself screamed at him. But she did not move. She did not attack. She did not even open her eyes. She only lay there, as if the storm had thrown her into his shelter and she had claimed the space beside him without asking. The silence stretched. His breath grew shallow, and his ears filled with the sound of his own heart. What would she do if he tried to rise? What would she do if he pushed her away? He had no answers. He only knew that he could not shout, could not break the fragile stillness between them. The storm battered the walls harder, like a beast demanding to come in. Dust slipped through the cracks, covering the floor in fine powder. The heater gave, another weak flicker, and for a moment the alien's face was lit fully. Her eyes were closed, but her expression was calm. There was no sign of malice, only exhaustion. Her body carried wounds, burns along her arm, cuts across her side. She had come here not as a conqueror, but as someone fleeing the same merciless storm that hunted him. Rourke stayed awake long after that realization, staring at her, unsure if he should be afraid or not. He had been alone for so many days that he had almost forgotten what it felt like to share space with another living being. Loneliness had gnawed at him, whispering that he was the last human left on this forsaken world. Now, against all reason, there was life again. Not human life, not safe life, but life nonetheless. He thought of home. He thought of Earth, with its endless skies and seas that no storm could erase. He thought of the way humanity had always survived, not by strength, but by refusing to let fear rule every choice. The knife at his belt remained untouched. His hand slowly relaxed. The alien shifted slightly, pulling the blanket closer around herself. For a moment, her shoulder brushed against his arm. The contact was light, but it sent a jolt through him. It was real. She was real. Not a dream. Not a shadow. A living, breathing being sharing his shelter, lying silently beside him as if they had known each other longer than a heartbeat. He closed his eyes again, though sleep did not come this time. He stayed awake, listening to the storm, feeling the strange rhythm of her breath close to his own. He wondered if she would wake before him. He wondered if, when morning came, they would still be lying side by side in the silence, neither enemy nor friend, just survivors in a world that wanted them both dead. And though fear still whispered in his chest, a small part of him felt something else, something unfamiliar after so many days of isolation. Not trust, not yet, but a spark of something close. Hope. Rourke did not know how long he had stared at her before his body forced him to move. The storm outside still screamed, but his ears had grown used to it, the noise like a second heartbeat. He shifted quietly, the knife still within reach, though. His hand never touched it. The alien still lay beside him, her breathing steady, her wounds hidden beneath strange cloth that shimmered faintly in the weak light. He told himself it was only survival. She must have been desperate to enter his shelter. She could have killed him if she wished, but she had not. That thought burned in his mind as the hours passed. If she had wanted him dead, he would not have woken. That meant she needed this place as much as he did. When she finally opened her eyes, the moment hit him harder than any storm. They were bright, almost glowing, like polished glass catching sunlight. She looked at him directly. No fear, no hostility. For a long time, neither moved. The silence between them was heavy, broken only by the sound of the wind pressing against the shelter walls. Rourke sat up slowly, making sure not to appear threatening. His throat was dry and his voice came out rough. "You understand me?" he asked, even though he knew the chances were slim. Her eyes narrowed slightly. She tilted her head as if studying him. No reply came. She simply breathed in and out, watching him. He frowned and reached for his canteen. The last half measure of water sloshed inside. It was his only supply until he could dig out the frozen stream again after the storm. He hesitated. Then, against every survival instinct he had, he extended it toward her. Her gaze flicked from his face to the canteen. Her long fingers moved, slow and deliberate, as she took it from him. She did not rush to drink. Instead, she studied the object, turned it in her hands, and then raised it to her lips. The sound of her swallowing seemed impossibly loud in the cramped shelter. When she lowered it, she gave it back without spilling a drop. Rourke accepted it, staring at her. "So, you do understand," he muttered, though he knew she hadn't spoken a word. Her expression softened, almost unreadable, but there was no malice in it. She shifted again, sitting upright. The burns on her arm were clearer now, angry red marks that had cracked the silvery skin. His training told him he should not care. She was the enemy. Her people had burned his fleet, scattered his unit, and left him stranded. But she was injured, and humans did not look away from the wounded, not when they had the power to help. He tore a strip from the edge of his blanket, dipped it in what was left of his antiseptic pack, and held it out. She watched him carefully. He motioned toward her arm, showing her what he meant. For a moment he thought she would refuse, but slowly, with the same silence she had carried since he first saw her, she extended her arm. Her skin was warmer than he expected, almost too warm, as he pressed the cloth gently to the burn. She flinched but did not pull away. He worked carefully, wrapping the wound with the improvised bandage. "There," he whispered, as though speaking too loudly would shatter the fragile truce between them. She glanced down at the bandage, then back at him. Her lips moved, forming sounds that almost resembled words, but none that he understood. Still, the meaning was clear enough. Gratitude. Time passed like that. Neither spoke a common language, but small gestures built something more important than words. She noticed the heater faltering and crawled to it, her hands moving with practiced skill over the circuits. Rourke watched as she bent a wire, realigned a coil, and coaxed the weak hum back into a steady rhythm. When the warmth returned, she looked at him again, her expression calm. He nodded once. "Thank you." Later, when he searched his ration pack, she stopped him with a raised hand. She moved to a corner of the shelter, pulling out a small bundle from her side pouch. Inside were thin strips of dried fungus, strange in smell, but not unpleasant. She tore a piece and handed it to him. Rourke hesitated, then chewed it carefully. It was bitter but edible. She gave a faint, satisfied nod, then ate a piece herself. They shared the food in silence, each watching the other for signs of betrayal that never came. As the storm dragged on, their silent exchange became routine. He showed her where to sleep so the cold draft would not reach. She gestured when the heater's power needed conserving. He cleaned her wounds again. She listened for approaching drones with senses sharper than his own. It was not friendship. Not yet. But it was survival. And in survival, trust was worth more than any weapon. When darkness fell again and he lay back against the metal floor, Rourke realized something strange. For the first time since the crash, he did not feel entirely alone. He turned his head slightly. She was lying beside him again, silent, steady, her eyes closed as if the shelter truly belonged to both of them. He did not know what tomorrow would bring, whether she would leave, betray him, or stay. But tonight, in the middle of a storm that could kill them both, they had found something rare. Not peace, not safety, but a fragile kind of understanding. And for a man who had thought himself the last living soul on this world, that was enough. The storm began to weaken after 3 long days, though its echo still rumbled outside like a beast unwilling to give up its hunt. The shelter no longer shook so violently, and the dust that slipped through the cracks fell in softer drifts. Rourke sat by the heater watching its steady glow, while the alien sat across from him. They no longer stared at each other with the same sharp caution as before. The silence between them felt different now, less like a wall, more like a bridge, waiting to be crossed. Her wounds were healing under his bandages, though slowly. She tested her arm, flexing her long fingers with careful movements. When she caught him watching, she gave a small nod, the closest thing to thanks he had seen from her since she had first taken his water. Rourke found himself nodding back without thinking. It surprised him how natural it was becoming. Sharing food, sharing warmth, tending wounds, keeping watch in turns. These small acts had made them partners in survival, even if no words confirmed. She never tried to take his knife, never pushed him aside to claim more space. In her silence, she had shown him something that words could not. She did not see him as prey. Not anymore. Still, the unease remained. He knew who she was, or at least what she represented, an enemy soldier, one of the people who had destroyed his fleet and left him stranded on this broken world. If she remembered that truth, it could all change in an instant. His life hung on a thread thinner than a strand of hair. That night, as they shared the last of the fungus strips she had brought, the heater flickered again. She leaned closer to check it, her face lit by the faint orange glow. Rourke studied her features, wondering how someone who had been raised to see humans as weak could sit so calmly in his presence. He realized then that she must be asking herself the same question about him. Why hadn't he killed her when he had the chance? The answer rose in his chest, one he didn't want to admit out loud. Because she looked just as tired, just as lost, just as human as he felt. Later, as the wind softened into distant whispers, Rourke lay awake, unable to sleep. He heard the faint rustle of movement beside him. She had turned toward him, her glowing eyes open in the dark. For the first time, she broke the silence with sound. Not words, not in his language, but a soft murmur, a tone that seemed like a question. He shook his head slowly. "I don't understand." Her brows drew together. She repeated the sound, pointing lightly at her chest. He blinked, realizing she was telling him her name. He could not repeat it. The sound was too smooth, too alien for his tongue. But he pointed at his own chest and said, "Rourke." She tilted her head. "Rourke." Her attempt was rough, clumsy, but it made him laugh quietly for the first time since the crash. The sound startled both of them. For a moment, even in that broken shelter with death only a storm away, they shared something close to relief. The following morning, with the storm finally easing, Rourke prepared to step outside. He strapped his knife to his belt and adjusted the cracked visor of his helmet. She watched him closely, then reached for her own equipment. Though she still moved with some pain, She carried herself with the quiet strength of someone who had survived worse. When they stepped beyond the shelter, the land stretched out in jagged silence. Dust lay thick, the sky a pale gray. Here and there, broken pieces of metal marked where wreckage had scattered. Rourke scanned the horizon, searching for signs of drones. She lifted her head, listening. It struck him then how natural it felt. Moving, as a pair, watching opposite directions, covering each other without words. They walked together, their footsteps muffled in the dust. He led them to the frozen stream he had used before, showing her how to break the crust of ice and gather the clean water beneath. She crouched beside him, studying the method. When he handed her the first full container, she accepted it without hesitation. The day passed with small exchanges like that. She showed him plants hidden in the shadows of rocks, roots tough but edible when boiled. He showed her how to use his emergency beacon to check for signals, even though none had reached him yet. Neither spoke the other's language, but both understood the same truth. Survival demanded cooperation. When night came again, they returned to the shelter with food and water enough for days. The heater still worked, glowing steady under her repairs. Rourke sat down heavily, exhaustion pressing into his bones. Across from him, she leaned against the wall, her eyes half closed. They had not spoken more than a few sounds. Yet in 3 days they had built something stronger than many words could. Not friendship, not trust in its full form, but something that lived between those things. A silent pact, unspoken but powerful. They would not harm each other. They would face the storm, the hunger, the empty land, together. For Rourke, who had thought himself the last living soul on this world, it was almost enough to feel human again. The days after the storm became a strange rhythm. Rourke had grown used to loneliness, the empty hours filled only by the sound of wind and his own breathing. Now, every moment seemed doubled. When he gathered water, she was there. When he checked the horizon for patrols, she scanned it with him. When he slept, he woke to find her lying silently at his side, her breathing steady as if she trusted him not to harm her. It was strange, almost unnatural, and yet it felt right in a way he could not explain. They could not speak to each other in words, but gestures had become their language. When she wanted him to wait, she raised her hand. When he needed her attention, he tapped the metal wall twice. Small things became signals, and signals became understanding. It amazed Rourke how quickly 2 strangers could find a way to live side by side. One evening, while he boiled roots she had collected, she studied him closely. Her eyes glowed faintly in the dim light, and she tilted her head like someone examining a puzzle. She made a sound, short and soft, then pointed at his chest. He knew what she wanted. He tapped his chest. "Rourke." She repeated it, smoother, this time. Then she touched her own chest and spoke her name again. The sound soft, rolling, impossible for him to repeat perfectly. He tried anyway. She laughed, or something close to it. A sound like a sigh mixed with a hum. It filled the shelter with warmth more real than the heater's glow. As the days passed, her strength returned. The burns on her arm healed and she began moving more freely. Rourke noticed she was not only surviving, she was working to keep him alive too. She warned him away from plants that looked safe but were poisonous. She showed him how to set small traps for crawling creatures that hid under rocks. She had no reason to help him, yet she did. One night, after they had shared the last of the dried fungus, she placed her hand flat against the ground, then pointed upward. She spoke in her language, slow and deliberate. Rourke could not understand, but he guessed she was telling him about the sky, maybe her people, maybe where she came from. He listened in silence, nodding when her eyes searched his face for reaction. In return, he took out the small patch of cloth he kept hidden, the torn flag from his uniform. The sight of it made his chest ache. He held it up and whispered, "Earth." She leaned closer, her glowing eyes fixed on the faded emblem. She repeated the word carefully, as if shaping it with care. "Earth." For a long moment, neither spoke again. It was enough. but their fragile peace was not safe from the world outside. On the 12th day since she had entered his shelter, a sound cut through the quiet night. Not the wind, not the heater, not the scrape of sand. A low hum, mechanical, growing louder. Rourke froze, his heart pounding. He knew that sound. Search drones. She heard it too. Her body stiffened, her glowing eyes narrowing with sharp awareness. She rose quickly, moving to the door of the shelter. Rourke followed, gripping his knife, though he knew it was useless against machines. Together they pressed against the metal, while listening. The hum grew stronger, passing overhead. The shadows of light swept across the cracks, pale beams cutting through the dust. Rourke held his breath. The drones were searching the wasteland for survivors. If they found her, they would take her back. If they found him, they would end him without hesitation. The light paused outside the shelter, lingering for one endless second. He felt her hand press lightly against his arm, steadying him. Then, after a moment that stretched like a lifetime, the hum faded into the distance. The lights vanished. The night returned to silence. They did not move for a long time. Finally, she lowered her hand and exhaled. Her gaze met his, and in her eyes he saw something new. Not just trust, but choice. She could have called out. She could have revealed him to the drones, but she had not. She had chosen him over her people. Rourke felt a strange weight settle in his chest. Gratitude, yes. Relief. But also responsibility. She was no longer just another survivor in his shelter. She was his ally now, whether either of them had meant it or not. That night, when they lay down in the quiet, their shoulders brushed once, again. Neither moved away. The storm outside had passed, but another kind of storm was coming, one filled with decisions neither of them could avoid. And though Rourke still could not speak her language, and she could not speak his, he knew one thing clearly: they were no longer enemies. The storm had gone, leaving the world quiet but dangerous. Rourke stepped outside with her at his side, the gray dust crunching beneath their boots. The sky was pale, heavy with clouds that never seemed to move. For days the land had been hidden, but now it stretched open before them, broken and scarred by wreckage. Twisted metal from fallen ships lay half buried in the ground. Shattered glass glimmered faintly in the weak light. Rourke scanned the horizon. His instincts told him the drones would return. Search patterns always did. His survival training whispered that the safest choice was to stay hidden, to remain in the shelter until the chance of discovery passed. But another thought gnawed at him. Sooner or later they would be found. The shelter could not protect them forever. She seemed to know it too. Her glowing eyes searched the sky with sharp focus. Every faint hum of wind made her tense. When she turned to him, her expression was clear. They could not stay. They moved together across the barren ground, keeping close to the jagged ridges of rock. Rourke's legs ached from exhaustion, but he pushed forward. She set a steady pace, her steps silent, her movements precise. Sometimes she stopped, placing her hand against the ground as if listening through the soil. Each time, Rourke waited. When she moved again, he followed without question. Hours passed like that, the two of them weaving through canyons and broken plains. They spoke no words, yet their silence carried meaning. She would point at plants hidden in shadows, and he would gather them. He would motion toward safe paths, and she would nod. Slowly, Rourke realized they had stopped being strangers running from each other. They had become a team. As the sun sank low, the faint hum of engines returned. This time it was not a single drone. The sound grew louder, multiplied, heavy with power. Rourke's chest tightened. He grabbed her arm and pulled her into the shadow of a canyon wall. Together they crouched, pressed against the stone. Light swept the ground again, stronger than before. Search drones glided overhead, their sensors glowing like sharp eyes. Rourke held his breath, every muscle locked. The memory of his destroyed fleet rose in his mind. Ships burning, comrades lost, the hopeless retreat. He felt the same helplessness now, but he forced it down. He could not afford fear. Beside him, she stayed still, her face calm but focused. Her hand brushed lightly against his again, not in fear, but in steady reassurance. She was not his enemy here. She was his partner in survival. The drones hovered for long minutes before drifting onward. Their lights vanished into the distance, leaving the canyon in shadow once more. Rourke exhaled slowly, his body trembling with relief. They waited until silence returned fully, then continued their path deeper into the rocks. Night fell quickly, the world turning black except for the faint glow of her eyes. Rourke followed that glow like a guide, every step taking them farther from the shelter, farther from safety, but closer to freedom. At last they reached a small hollow in the rock, hidden from open sight. Exhaustion pressed down on both of them. They sat in silence, catching their breath. The stars above were faint, blurred by dust, but Rourke stared at them anyway. Somewhere out there was Earth. Somewhere out there, his people still fought. She noticed his gaze. Slowly, she raised her hand and pointed upward too. She spoke in her language, quiet and low, her voice carrying something almost like sadness. Rourke did not understand the words, but he understood the feeling. She was far from home, just as he was. He wanted to say something back, but no words came. Instead, he took out the broken comm unit from his pack. Its screen flickered weakly, a device long out of reach of any real signal. But when she leaned closer, curiosity lighting her face, he showed her how it worked. He tapped the side, showed her the static that once had been voices. She touched the screen with care, as if holding a piece of something precious. For a long moment, both of them stared at the faint glow. It was a reminder that they were not meant to be here forever. Later, when they lay down to rest in the hollow, Rourke kept his knife near as always, but he realized his hand no longer gripped it with the same fear. Instead, he found himself listening to her steady breathing beside him, the sound almost comforting after so many nights of silence. Sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deeper than it had been in weeks. He knew tomorrow would bring more. Danger, drones, patrols, the endless search. He knew their fragile bond could be broken at any moment if old loyalties returned. Yet as the night wrapped around them, he allowed himself one dangerous thought. Maybe survival was not enough. Maybe, in this strange alliance with someone who should have been his enemy, he had found something greater than survival. And that thought, as fragile as it was, gave him strength for what was still to come. The next morning, the air was sharp and cold. Dust still clung to every surface, but the wind had gone, leaving a silence that felt heavier than the storm itself. Rourke rose stiffly, his joints aching from the hard ground. She was already awake, crouched near the mouth of the hollow, her eyes glowing faintly as she scanned the canyon. When he joined her, she gave a small nod toward the horizon. He followed her gaze. Far in the distance, faint lines of movement crossed the sky. Patrol ships, not just drones. His stomach tightened. That meant the search was widening. They were hunting survivors, and sooner or later the canyon would no longer keep them safe. They gathered their few supplies and moved on. She led the way at first, her movements quiet and precise, guiding them through narrow cracks in the rocks where even the wind struggled to pass. When the path grew steep, Rourke moved ahead, carving footholds with his knife so she could climb more easily. The rhythm they had built, silent signals, small gestures, carried them through the morning without a word spoken. As the sun climbed higher, the sound of engines returned. This time it was closer, louder, vibrating through the stone beneath their feet. Rourke pulled her into a narrow crevice just as shadows passed over them. A patrol drone drifted above, its searchlights cutting through the dust. They pressed close against the rock, breaths shallow. Rourke's heart hammered in his chest. He knew that if the drone's sensors scanned the crevice, they would have no chance. His knife was nothing against its weapons. He braced himself, preparing for the worst. Then her hand moved. Slow, deliberate, she pulled a small device from her belt, something he hadn't seen before. It was no weapon, more like a shard of metal fitted with wires. She tapped it lightly against the stone, releasing a faint hum. The drone froze mid-air, its lights flickering, then turned sharply away, drifting in the opposite direction as if their presence had vanished. Rourke stared at her, astonished. She met his eyes calmly, then tucked the device back into her belt. He wanted to ask what it was, how it worked, but words could not pass between them. Instead, he gave a single nod, and she returned it. By midday, they had left the canyon behind and entered a wide plain. The land was flat, broken only by jagged spires of black stone. Rourke disliked the openness of it, but there was no other path forward. He kept his eyes on the horizon, searching for cover, while she listened intently, her head tilting at the faintest sounds. When they reached a cluster of stones, they stopped to rest. Rourke pulled out the comm unit, still useless but comforting. He tapped it as if by chance it might connect. Static answered him. She sat beside him, watching with quiet interest. For a moment, they both stared at the faint glow of the screen. He pointed at the sky. "Home," he said softly. "Earth." She repeated the word carefully, almost perfect this time. Then she touched her chest, spoke her own word again. Her home. He could not repeat it, but he understood. They were both far from the places they belonged. Both outcasts, both hunted, both surviving only because of each other. The sound of engines shattered the moment. Louder this time, much closer. Rourke shoved the comm unit back into his pack and motioned for her to move. Together they scrambled into the shadow of the stones, just as 3 drones swept across the plain. Their lights cut the ground like blades, scanning, hunting. This time there was no narrow crevice to hide in, no easy escape. Rourke gripped his knife, knowing how hopeless it was, but unwilling to surrender. She crouched beside him, her hand on the strange device again, though her face showed strain. He realized it might not work a second time. The drones hovered, beams sweeping closer. Dust rose in swirls as their engines rumbled. Rourke's pulse pounded in his ears. Then he felt her touch his arm again, firm and steady. She looked at him, her eyes sharp with meaning. Not enemy, not alone. On instinct, he reached into his pack and pulled out the broken beacon. He twisted wires, forced a spark, and tossed it out into the open. The drones reacted instantly, veering toward the sudden signal. Their lights shifted, their engines roared, and within moments they were moving away, chasing the false target. Silence. Returned. Rourke slumped against the stone, his chest heaving with relief. She gave a faint, surprised sound, something close to a laugh. For the first time, she had seen what human desperation and ingenuity could do. No weapon, no advanced technology, only scraps and stubborn will, and yet it had saved them. As night fell, they pressed onward. Rourke felt exhaustion deep in his bones, but he also felt something stronger. Every step with her at his side made him realize the truth. They were no longer just surviving, they were moving toward something. Not safety yet, not freedom yet, but possibility. When they stopped to rest, she lay down close to him again, the way she always had since that first night in the shelter. Their shoulders brushed lightly. Neither moved away. Above them, the stars burned faint through the dust, cold and distant but alive. Rourke closed his eyes, holding on to the thought that had carried him this far. Humanity did not give up. And now neither did she. Together they would face whatever came next. The plain stretched endlessly before them, but Rourke knew they were close. His comm unit, weak as it was, had flickered with a signal earlier that day. It was faint, broken, but real. Somewhere ahead was the edge of the search zone, and maybe, just maybe, a chance for rescue. She walked beside him, her steps steady even though both of them carried exhaustion like chains. The glow of her eyes dimmed in the pale light, but her expression was sharp, alert, unafraid. Every so often she scanned the sky, and Rourke could feel the tension in her movements. They were not safe yet. By evening, the hum of engines returned, louder, heavier. This time it was not just drones. Dark shapes crossed the sky, patrol ships moving in formation. Rourke's heart sank. If they were caught in the open now, there would be no escape. He led her toward a ridge of rocks jutting from the plain. They crouched behind the stone, waiting. The ships passed overhead, beams of light sweeping across the ground like giant blades. The sound rattled through his chest, a reminder of the power that had destroyed his fleet. He remembered fire, metal torn apart, the screams of his comrades. For a moment, despair pressed down on him. Then he felt her hand brush lightly against his shoulder. He turned. She was looking at him, her expression calm, steady. In her eyes he saw no fear, only determination. She was not giving up, and she did not expect him to give up either. The ships drifted on, leaving silence behind. Rourke let out a long breath. His mind cleared, and with it came resolve. They could not run forever. They needed to reach the signal zone before the patrols closed the net. He pointed toward the horizon, showing her the direction. She nodded, and together they pressed forward. Night came quickly, the stars faint through the haze. The comm unit flickered again, stronger this time. A weak pulse. His chest tightened with hope. He tapped the screen, watching the static shift. If he could boost the signal, maybe a human ship could hear it. Maybe rescue was possible. But rescue meant something else too. If a human ship came, they would see her as the enemy. They would not understand the bond built in silence, the trust forged in survival. They would see only a soldier of the empire that had tried to erase them. And if her people arrived first, they would see him the same way. An intruder, an enemy, a life to be ended. The weight of that truth sat heavy on him. He glanced at her, wondering if she knew. She met his gaze, and for a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The unspoken words hung between them. They could not both be saved by their own people. The distant hum of engines returned, this time from two directions. Lights cut across the horizon, one beam white and sharp, the other golden. Rourke's breath caught. He recognized the white light. Human rescue ships used that signature. The golden one belonged to hers. Both had arrived at the same time. She froze, her eyes locked on the golden glow. He looked at the white. Two choices, two fates. If they stepped toward one, the other would mean death. For a long, terrible second, neither moved. Then she turned her gaze back to him. Slowly, deliberately, she reached out and took his hand. The touch was firm, steady, she whispered, in halting words that sounded strange in her mouth but clear enough for him to understand. Stay. Rourke felt something shift inside him. She could have chosen her people. She could have betrayed him to the drones days ago, but she had not. She had chosen him, chosen humanity, chosen something beyond war and empire. In that moment, he understood the truth of it. Humanity's strength was not only in fighting, it was in reaching out, even to those who were meant to be enemies. It was in building bridges where none should exist. He squeezed her hand once, then raised the comm unit high. He forced its weak signal into the night, directing it toward the white glow. The human ship responded, its beacon pulsing stronger. The golden light of her people lingered in the distance, searching, but moving away. She had given up her return, for him. As the rescue ship descended, engines tearing the dust into a storm, Rourke held her hand tighter. Soldiers rushed out, their weapons ready, their eyes wide at the sight of her. Shouts rang out, orders barked, but Rourke stepped forward, placing himself between them and her. His voice was rough but unshaken. She's with me. The soldiers hesitated. They did not understand, but they lowered their weapons, uncertain, waiting for command. Rourke turned his head slightly, looking at her one last time. She stood tall, silent as always, her glowing eyes fixed on him. He knew their paths might soon split. Maybe she could not remain with him. Maybe his people would never accept her. But what they had shared here on this broken world would never be erased. Against every law, against every lesson of war, they had proven something greater. That in the endless darkness of space, humanity's light was not in its weapons, but in its will to see an ally where others saw only an enemy. And for the first time since the war began, Rourke believed that hope could survive.